From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. During our first half hour today, full details on 3 USDA programs designed to assist you livestock producers who are rebounding from various disasters over the past couple of years, including drought, wildfire, blizzards. From the Farm Service Agency, Blaine Rutherford will join us to go through the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, the Livestock Indemnity Program, and the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program. In particular, there have been changes to those latter 2 programs that you producers need to know about. Also, further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee returns this week to look at a new study of house mice control products and their effectiveness in ridding of mice in homes and outbuildings. Plus more, here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Many a livestock producer here in Kansas has encountered obstacles over the past 2 or 3 years: drought, wildfires, blizzards, and seemingly everything in between. The USDA continues to make available a trio of programs which can provide valuable assistance to you producers who are confronted with these challenges. Blaine Rutherford is an agricultural program specialist with the Farm Service Agency state headquarters here in Manhattan. Blaine will pass along as much detail as we can in our time today, but suffice it to say, as you look across the scope of these programs, there's a lot going on here.
Yes, sir, that's correct. We have a collection of livestock-centered programs. We have the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, which compensates for feed, for grazing losses. We have the Livestock Indemnity Program, which covers losses, death losses. We'll discuss that briefly today. Mm-hmm. And we have the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, which is sort of a catch-all. They're feed losses. It compensates for honeybees, for farm-raised fish, and to some degree, livestock cattle death.
And we want to go through each of these individually here and their application in Kansas and talk about the Livestock Forage Disaster Program. LFP is the acronym. You mentioned it's addressing grazing losses. This is quite appropriate, given where we're at right now with our forage resources in Kansas, Blaine.
That's absolutely true. Unfortunately, the drought is back in force. Many of your listeners will be familiar with this program from the 2011 to 2014. There's such bad drought years. This program was revamped as a result of those drought years, and it's to provide compensation to our livestock producers that are suffering grazing losses on covered livestock, on eligible pasture or grazing land due to qualifying drought conditions at the county level. The program is driven off of the U.S. Drought Monitor, which is headquartered out of Lincoln, Nebraska. But every week there's a drought monitor released for the entire nation, and it goes all the way down to the county level. The county where these livestock producers are located must have been in a D2 rating, which the drought monitor goes from D0 being the least to D4 being the greatest, most severe drought. But they must have been in a D2 status for at least 8 consecutive weeks during the normal grazing period. There's an eligibility tool located at the U.S. Drought Monitor website, and as well, the Farm Service Agency posts eligibility maps through their webpage for each category of pasture or grazing land.
The individual livestock producer then merely needs to have owned livestock within the prescribed window where this applies?
That's correct. Livestock producers who legally owned or were in a contract to purchase livestock in a 60-day window prior to the drought triggering are eligible. Now, when I say that a drought triggers, this means that, the county, as I said before, has been in a D2 status for 8 consecutive weeks. That U.S. Drought Monitor releases every week. and those livestock would have had to have been owned in the 60-day window leading up to that.
Must the producer also own or otherwise control the grazing resource we're talking about here?
That's correct. In addition to owning or being in control of eligible livestock, the producer must have eligible grazing land. This can be owned, it can be leased. Again, we're talking about native pasture, improved pastures such as brome, fescue, wheat for grazing, small grains for grazing. We're even getting as far as annual ryegrasses, sorghum planted for the explicit purpose of providing forage, grazed forage. So you must have that. That's the other component of this formula is you have to have eligible land in the county where the drought is located, and you must have eligible livestock that would be grazing that land during the normal grazing period.
And if one is in fact leasing that land, they need to confirm that with documentation.
That's right. FSA loves its documentation. You either have to provide the written lease between you, the cattle operator, and your landlord. If you do not have a written lease, if you have a handshake deal or something, FSA has developed a form where you and the landlord can sign the form, indicate the terms of the lease, and that will serve in lieu of an actual written lease.
Now, it should be clear, but just to emphasize, we're not talking about cattle in a feedlot setting here.
That's right. Cattle that would have normally been in a feed yard during the normal grazing period are not eligible. However, if you normally have these livestock out on native pasture, and due to the drought you had to pull them and put them in a dry lot, those livestock would be eligible. And by the same token, if you had livestock and sold them due to the drought, those could be eligible as well.
So again, under the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, how are the payments calculated? What formula is used here?
As I mentioned before, the program is driven off of the U.S. Drought Monitor. Mm-hmm. So there are different monthly payments attached to each of these drought monitor, most of the drought monitor levels. For example, 8 consecutive weeks at the D2, that's the lowest end that will trigger for this program, that will get you a 1-month payment. And what that is the national office has developed a monthly payment rate, which would be the equivalent of feeding the livestock category for 1 month. Mm-hmm. So you would get that amount times the number of livestock in that category times the number of months that you're eligible. Another example, if the county is in severe enough that they reach the D4 rating at any point in time in the grazing season, they would be eligible for a 4-month payment.
So it's a step-up program.
It is a step-up.
Depending on the severity of the drought.
Right. As the drought intensifies, you become eligible for additional payments. And the monthly payment rate is equal to 60% of the lesser of the monthly feed costs, as I mentioned before, for either all of the covered livestock that are owned or leased by the producer, or it's calculated using the normal carrying capacity for the eligible grazing land. So, for example, say a livestock producer has 80 head of adult beef cows. However, they only have enough native pasture to support 60 head. So the payment would be limited to that carrying capacity, that's 60 head times the payment rate times the number of months.
Mm-hmm. And there is something of a cap on the program. You can not have any more than 5 monthly payments. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. The total LFP payments to an eligible livestock producer per calendar year will not exceed 5 monthly payments for the same livestock. And this is across all counties. So if a livestock producer had some cows that he moved across a couple of different counties, those livestock can only get paid for 5 months, regardless of how many different counties where they graze.
Now, producers would like to have dollars and cents figures to consider here why they can access those fairly handily, can't they?
They can. Our website has a large number of fact sheets, including one for the Livestock Forage Program. The easier method is just to call your local county office. They will have the handbook. They will have the fact sheets. Just for example purposes, for 2018, adult beef cows and bulls can expect a monthly payment of $28.07 per head.
You need more figures. Why, again, tap those sources and get a look for yourselves. And if you need more figures, why, again, tap those sources and get a look for yourselves. And there is an overall comprehensive cap on how much one can earn from this program or the emergency program, right?
That's correct. With anything, the government has limits, FSA has limits. No person or legal entity, excluding joint ventures, general partnerships, may receive directly or indirectly more than $125,000 in payment under the LFP and ELAP programs per program year. So when we say we exclude joint ventures and general partnerships, the way those are structured, you have that $125,000 payment limit by the number of individuals or entities within that joint venture or partnership. In addition to that, there is a limitation on adjusted gross income. You must make less than $900,000. If you're in excess of this adjusted gross income, you're not eligible to apply for LFP benefits.
And all clarification can be gained at that local office. That's where you apply for this assistance.
That's absolutely correct. It's one of the first forms that you will have to fill out when you apply is as an income verification form.
And is there a deadline for applying then?
There is a deadline. For the LFP program, all interested parties must file an application, including all of their supporting documentation, those leases, anything that they have in regards to supporting their livestock numbers, must be submitted by January 30th, 2019 to be considered.
All right. Well, Blaine, if we might squeeze in a quick word here about the Livestock Indemnity Program and its status in Kansas.
Your listeners are probably aware this is the death loss program. If you lose livestock due to a blizzard or a wildfire or lightning, you can be eligible to receive compensation for losses in excess of normal mortality. Now, the Budget Act came in on a big way on this program and made some changes, the biggest of which is that $125,000 payment limitation no longer applies to the Livestock Indemnity Program, the LIP program. This is, great news for larger operations that may have sustained significant losses in the 2017 wildfires and those blizzards that they had out west.
Our guest once again on Agriculture Today, Blaine Rutherford from the Farm Service Agency. He'll be back in a moment with more here on the K-State Radio Network. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Agriculture Today continues now. Again, we're bringing you livestock producers up to speed on the latest changes within a trio of USDA assistance programs to producers who have endured various hardships the past 2 years. Mike's side once more is Blaine Rutherford, an agricultural program specialist with the Farm Service Agency State Office. Blaine, before the break, you outlined for us the details of the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, LFP, also a brief comment on the Livestock Indemnity Program. There's this third opportunity, to put it that way, the USDA's Emergency Assistance for Livestock Program. Now, does it work in concert, in a sense, with the LFP?
In a way, it can work in concert with LFP, and it is sort of a catch-all. It catches everything that is not already covered under the LFP program, which we discussed, and the Livestock Indemnity Program, which is death-related. This program is a great example of how programs and legislation can change over the course of a farm bill. Mm-hmm. Originally, this program was a $20 million fund that covered eligible livestock death losses, feed losses, grazing losses, water transportation and drought, farm-raised fish losses, and honeybee losses. With the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, the $20 million cap was removed. It made this program a lot more appealing. It was previously factored down so that we could make a payment to everybody and remain under that $20 million cap. So in addition to increasing the available funding for ELAP, this budget change allows us to make payments on demand. So in the past, you had to have your application in by November 1st. We would take all the applications, divvy up that $20 million, and pay you sometime the next spring, typically around March. Now, if you suffer losses, and we'll discuss the variety of losses that are eligible, some of them, you can go into your office, submit your application, your supporting documentation, and get paid typically 2 weeks to a month after that, just depending on when the county committee meets next. So it's a lot more responsive.
And what's more, because this change came about here in 2018 with the Budget Act, this has been declared retroactive to those who incurred losses in 2017 as well, you say?
That's absolutely right. That was the other major change to the ELAP program. The Budget Act allows us to look back to 2017. We had a great many fires in 2017, ranging from all sizes. They caused a lot of damage, destroyed a lot of pasture, destroyed a lot of hay. So Congress wanted to revise this and provide that opportunity back to 2017, being aware that there were so many losses. So in many cases, these producers either were not aware of the program or realized that there was only $20 million split up across the entire country. These people will have an opportunity to come back in and put a claim where they didn't before.
And under this program, who's eligible?
Under this program, the main category that I want to talk about today are feed and hay losses as well as grazing losses. So for the feed losses, this is going to be a livestock producer who, as in the LFP program, owned eligible livestock in a 60-day window before the disaster or weather event occurred. The producer must provide their livestock inventory numbers. We've got to know how many you have, as well as information about the pasture land or grazing land that was available to the livestock during the normal grazing season, such as on the acreage report that most of our customers complete on an annual basis. And obviously they must have lost feed or grazing.
And how is that identified, feed losses here?
Typically, there's a notice of loss that must be filed. So, for example, the 2017 Starbuck fire in Clark County, we have a definite event that we're aware of. It came through, burned acres, destroyed hay. They come in and file a notice of loss, saying, I lost X number of bales of this sort of hay. They provide us with that notice of loss. Going off of that, we obtain their livestock numbers, the available pasture, and we calculate the feed needs on the livestock that they had on hand at the time of the disaster. This lets us know what did they have set back for use, what did these animals need, and that better helps us to calculate the payment.
And in as far as calculating those payments, again, one can get fairly deep into the weeds on this, but there are some general parameters here, you say.
That's true. The calculations are based on a minimum of 60% of the producer's actual cost for the livestock feed, which was purchased or mechanically harvested for use for the livestock that this producer actually owns that was physically damaged or destroyed due to, for example, a fire. It's important to note that the ELAP program is only going to pay for the feed that were needed to maintain the livestock that the producer has in inventory at the time of the event. The other thing to remember, in certain conditions where losses occur during the normal grazing season, the program can cover 60% of additional costs of feed purchased to maintain those livestock until grazing becomes available. So for this part of the program, the livestock producer must be able to furnish receipts of the livestock feed purchases for the current year as well as the two previous, so that we can just establish a baseline. That typically you only buy 50 bales of hay, but in this year, in addition to that 50, you had to buy another 30 just to give your pasture time to recover. And in any case, FSA is going to calculate the ELAP payments for the producer for the livestock for no more than 150 calendar days for feed destroyed.
Now, we talked earlier about the Forage Disaster Assistance Program here. Will this program, the emergency program, allow for compensation on grazing losses as well?
Yes, grazing losses are eligible for ELAP if they do not meet the criteria for the livestock feed program. So to put it plainly, an operation must have suffered a loss in grazing due to a wildfire on privately owned land, Another example of a loss that would be covered under ELAP that isn't covered under LFP would be grazing days lost due to flood or due to hail damage. Losses that may have occurred due to drought or wildfire on federally managed grazing land would be eligible for benefits under LFP and would not be eligible under this program. But this program does provide compensation for grazing losses.
So how does a producer follow through here and request one of these grazing payments through the emergency program?
As with the lost hay or feed payments, similar to the LFP program, an interested producer must provide their livestock inventory numbers and information about the affected pasture or grazing land. The program will provide compensation of up to a maximum of 150 days of grazing loss for non-fire events, so again, the flood, the hail damage, and will provide 180 days, up to 180 days worth of grazing loss in the event of a wildfire. Now, I want to stress that these are the maximums. The program takes into account how many days did you actually lose as a result of the wildfire or the hail or the flood. So the applicant has got to provide documentation, acceptable proof that they were prevented from turning their livestock out on these normal pastures during the grazing season, or that they grazed at a shorter period of time than they normally would to allow that pasture the time to recover. And for 2018, just so what about an idea what we're talking about, the daily livestock payment rate per head is roughly 94 cents per head per day, and you can get up to 180 days if you got a fire, which we had a great many of those in 2017. Keep in mind, if you had grazing losses in 2017, and there were a great many folks who did as a result of these fires, you've got another opportunity here. Mm-hmm. So think to yourself, did I have grazing losses? Is 94 cents per day per head something I'm interested in? And go to the county office with an open mind, with an understanding that there are pieces of this puzzle that you're going to have to provide to receive benefits. Mm-hmm.
Well, looking at all these collectively, the triangle, as you put it, awash in detail to be certain. And it is summer and a busy time for livestock producers, but it would behoove the individual to get into that FSA office and at least walk through the possibilities here, no matter which option they're looking at, Blaine.
I agree, absolutely. Especially with the ELAP and the LIP program, we have a rare opportunity here. Not very often do you get to go back and take another swing at things. So if you were on the fence last time, you sustained these losses. One other thing that I would say, the Budget Act allows us to provide some compensation on livestock that were damaged and had to be liquidated. If you sustain these losses, if you had damaged livestock due to one of these events in 2017 or at this point in 2018 and you haven't come and seen us, here's another opportunity. We're out here to provide assistance, and it's a great opportunity to offset a degree of loss that you have sustained at this point.
These programs are definitely a response to the assortment of adversities that our livestock producers have had to contend with here the last couple of years for sure. Once more, we're talking about the Emergency Assistance Program, the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, and the Livestock Indemnity Program. And to sort it all out, do have that conversation with your local FSA personnel on how any of these could be of assistance to you, producers. Blaine, we appreciate you covering all of this.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for being by today. Blaine Rutherford with us. He is an agricultural program specialist with the Farm Service Agency State Office for Kansas. We'll be back with more on this Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. Today's agricultural news headlines in brief for you now, courtesy in part of DTN, and the updated crop progress and condition report from the USDA for the state of Kansas. First of all, for the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies in the state are at 2% surplus, 63% adequate, but 35% short to very short, and subsoil moisture is at 2% surplus, 57% adequate, and 44% short to very short. The state of our corn crop in Kansas this week, 52% good to excellent, 32% fair, and 16% poor to very poor. Corn silking is now at 48%. That's ahead of the 34% average for the date, and corn in the dough stage is now at 6%. Soybean crop condition in Kansas, 51% good to excellent this week, 38% fair, 11% poor to very poor. Soybeans blooming now at 38%. That's well ahead of the 15% average for the date. And beans setting pods at 5% now. That's fairly close to the average. The condition of the Kansas grain sorghum crop is at 60% good to excellent, 33% fair, and 7% poor to very poor. Sorghum headed now at 6% around the state. And range and pasture conditions this week, 33% good to excellent, 39% fair, and 28% poor to very poor, according to the USDA. As for the state of the corn and soybean crops nationwide now, let's hear from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Over this past week, for the condition ratings of the nation's corn crop,
very slight erosion of those conditions.
Still, 75% of the corn rated in good to excellent condition, only 7% poor to very poor, and USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey told us
Those numbers are off a point from a week ago when we were at 76% good to excellent, 6% very poor to poor.
However, as good as the national numbers look, some areas seeing a 1-2 punch of heat and dryness.
And we're still seeing those issues in the southwestern Corn Belt. Missouri, another jump from 14 to 17% of the crop very poor to poor. Kansas going from 15 to 16%.
Meanwhile, for soybeans, steady from last week, 71% good to excellent. And as far as corn and soybean development,
with the warm weather, we continue to see a very, very rapid pace of crop development.
For corn, 37% of the crop already silking. The average is 18%. For soybeans,
47% blooming. 5-year average is just 27%.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And nationally, grain sorghum 25% headed now. That's behind the 5-year average of 27%. Sorghum coloring at 17% right on the average. And the condition of the sorghum crop nationally did slip again from 53% good to excellent the previous week down to 51% this past week. And the acting administrator of the EPA, after Scott Pruitt resigned, Andrew Wheeler, told the Wall Street Journal in an interview that he plans to continue that agency's current policy trajectory on environmental regulations. He said that while he's likely to continue President Trump and Pruitt's regulatory plans, there may be a shift in tone of how he puts it, how I talk about some things. I've thought about for years environmental issues that need to be depoliticized. Priorities, he says, include reducing the time it takes for environmental permitting and giving additional clarity on length of enforcement reviews. Wheeler said he believes in climate change, but there are legal limits to what the EPA can do about that. The article said Wheeler declined to say if he'd take the administrator job permanently if the nomination were offered. As for the renewable fuel standard, Wheeler said during his confirmation hearing back in November that the RFS is the law of the land and that he supports both the law and the intent of the RFS program. You're listening to Agriculture Today, now the weekly feature for you dairy producers from the Animal Sciences and Industry Department here at K-State. Milk lines, and waiting with that, as always, is Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning corn silage harvest and, well, just the current situation that we have with forages across much of the state of Kansas. As we look forward to corn silage harvest, one of the issues we have is that in many areas of the state we're having some severe droughts, particularly affecting the dryland corn. So if you were planning on harvesting that for corn silage, you need to be considering what the whole plant dry matter is of that crop. keeping in mind that when we start to see the brown leaves on top of the corn plants due to the drought, that it will dry down very quickly. So we may have to harvest before we actually have a lot of grain fill in order to have the correct moisture. We're still looking for 35% dry matter or 65% whole plant moisture when we harvest. With some of our newer inoculants that contain the L-butyrate bacteria, we might be able to go a little bit drier than that, maybe up to 38% to maybe 39% dry matter, and still get good fermentation. Will be important that if you go to a drier dry matter that you need to pay close attention to the chop length. If you get those silages chopped very long, you may have a tough time packing those in the silo, and therefore we may end up with increased spoilage. Now, one of the critical things I think for our dairy farms is to really assess where they're at on their forage supply as we move forward through the next 12 to 18 months. So you need to really plan. My guess is in many areas corn silage harvest will be short and we will have a deficit of forages. So how are we going to fill those deficits? Well, one of the things you might consider is if you take your corn off early because of the drought and we do get some moisture yet in late summer and fall, things like millet, sedan grasses, even short-season sorghums could provide some additional tonnage for your animals. The other thing you could consider doing is planting some winter cereals. You could use that for either grazing or wait and harvest that as a silage crop in the spring, again extending your limited supplies of forages that you might have already harvested. As you also consider things that you can do, there are some additional cover crops that could be planted this winter that might be able to provide some additional grazing for some of your animals, like dry cows, heifers, reducing the amount of stored forages that you actually have on the farm. Keep in mind also as we move forward that you need to be concerned about supplies of warm season grasses if that's what you're feeding to your transition cows or pre-fresh animals, as well as straw and other hay that you will need to feed other classes of animals besides your lactating cows. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to watch their corn silage harvest carefully to make sure that we harvest at the right moisture and to carefully plan for their forage supplies for the next 12 to 18 months.
Many thanks, Mike. Quick reminder to listen to the Agriculture Today podcast anytime you choose. Visit agtoday.net, and you can listen on demand and find links to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, and Spotify. agtoday.net. This is Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
This Agriculture Today closes out on another aspect of wildlife management. In the guest chair once again is wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, information that's been generated from a new study on house mouse control. And, well, house mice are a clear problem for many homeowners.
It's not just a few homeowners that have problems with house mice. It's a worldwide issue. Originally, the house mouse was from Middle East and from Asia. They've now followed humans around the world. They're very prolific, and populations have periodically erupted to cause plagues in some locations. But most of the time, it's just a few house mice in a dwelling that causes a considerable amount of concern. And we find that control, or particularly eradication of house mice, has been problematic using the existing rodenticide products. So the USDA APHIS Wildlife Services at the National Wildlife Research Center in Fort Collins, Colorado, set up a research project to look at some of the existing products that are out there and evaluate them in a caged mouse study for efficacy. Keep in mind there are probably hundreds of products available, but there are not that many active ingredients available that are in those products that are available for house mouse control.
And they looked at all of those primary ingredients then?
They looked at most of those primary ingredients. There are about 12 different products that they tested. They included first-generation anticoagulants. Those would have been things that were developed shortly after World War II. They also investigated the second-generation anticoagulants. Those are products that are used at a lower percentage of active ingredient. They're perhaps considered a little bit more toxic than first-generation anticoagulants. And many of the manufacturers claim that on the second-generation anticoagulants, mice may only need one feeding on those before consuming a lethal dose. And the research effort also tested some of the acute toxicants. Those would be things like zinc phosphide, which has been around for a very long time, probably the most widely used agricultural toxicant for rodents. They also tested bromethylene, which is a central nervous system disruptor, and cholecalciferol, another product that's considered an acute toxicant. So they decided to test all of those. They used free-ranging house mice that were live-trapped near Fort Collins on a dairy farm, and most of these were two-choice trials. So they had the products available for either a 3-day exposure or a 7-day exposure.
And then the effectiveness of these products was gauged here, and the results were rather definitive, you say.
Yeah, it was surprising to them, and I guess somewhat surprising to me in that I've seen some fairly good results, I thought, with the use of most of the commercially registered toxicants. But they found none of the first-generation anticoagulants that were tested resulted in more than a 20% efficacy with house mice. That was in the 3-day exposure. So if we're putting bait out and making it available for only 3 days on some of the manufacturers' claims that they can consume a lethal dose in one feeding, and we're only getting efficacy rates of 20%, then something's not quite right. Mm-hmm. And I think that was one of the shocking outcomes of this particular trial, in that these first-generation anticoagulants, including warfarin and difascinone, are probably not as good as what we've been expecting. So then they decided to run the 7-day test. With the 7-day test, they did get a little bit better control on some of the products, but again, nothing just real outstanding. At the same time the house mice trial was going on, they also tested Norway rats with a 3-day exposure, but for some reason the house mouse control was not very effective, but the Norway rat control, they got great results with the products.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah, it's somewhat surprising, and perhaps it's a matter of sample size and further study is going to be needed. But it is somewhat worrisome that the commercially available rodenticide baits that are available are not effective for house mice with only a 3-day exposure. Almost all of the rodenticides were effective with wild Norway rats, and the efficacy rates with house mice improved with the 7-day rodenticide exposure, but probably not enough to satisfy many consumers. So they tried to think of, some of the reasons why these baits were not working as well as they'd expected, and they come up with the idea that perhaps some of these mice were genetically predisposed to have some resistance to the anticoagulants. Keep in mind, these were wild-captured house mice, and they were from a dairy near Fort Collins, and that dairy had been using anticoagulant baits as part of its regular rodent control program, and perhaps there's more genetic resistance to some of these commercially available rodenticides than we had previously expected or has been reported. So in an effort, again, to come up with good products for house mice control, they did some experimental testing with combination of the existing products. and found that some of the combinations have a much higher efficacy than when the products are offered singly. But keep in mind that no two active ingredient rodenticides are currently registered in the United States. So the combination of some of those active ingredients shows promise, but it's a long road to convert those experimental efforts into a commercially available product. But I suspect with the results shown with this that you're going to have some sort of synergistic combination of active ingredients in order to get house mouse control, particularly in some of the areas where we've had a long history of using chemicals to reduce rodent problems.
Well, this revealing study out of the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, it tested the effectiveness of commonly marketed house mouse control products. And Charlie, we appreciate the word on this. Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And that is our time for today. Thanks for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.